In this video, we're going to talk about the leukocytes. Leuko means white, and cyte means cell. So with the leukocytes, we're talking about the white blood cells. These cells are very important in your immune defense. So when you think white blood cells, you really should be thinking immunity, protection against infection. The white blood cells are the only complete whole cells in the blood. Red blood cells are anucleate, and platelets are really just cell fragments. White blood cells, they have nuclei, even though those nuclei look kind of funny sometimes. Since their purpose is to fight infection, you will often see an increase in white blood cell numbers during infection, leukocytosis. So by doing a whole blood count and counting the numbers of white blood cells, you can determine if someone is experiencing an infection. And sometimes looking at the type of white blood cell that they have an excess of, that can tell you a little bit about what that infection might be. There are 5 types of white blood cells, and they can be grouped into 2 categories. You have the granulocytes. The granulocytes are your neutrophils, eosinophils, and your basophils. They're called granulocytes because of these visible granules in the cytoplasm. There. And here, there are so many granules in the cytoplasm of basophils that the nucleus almost disappears. The second category are the agranulocytes. There are 2 types of agranulocytes. Agranulocyte means without cytoplasmic granules, but they do have cytoplasmic granules, just not as many as the granulocytes and not as visible. You can see here there's some, but definitely not as many, and there's a few there as well. So the agranulocytes, you have your lymphocytes and your monocytes. We'll talk about these in depth when we cover the immune system, but for now I just want to introduce them and in a general sense what they each do. Leukocytes are very important, but they do make up a very small proportion of your blood volume, less than 1% of your total blood volume, right? In a differential white blood cell count, if you put all of the types of white blood cells together, you get about 5 to 11,000 white blood cells per microliter. If you go over 11,000 cells per microliter, that's considered leukocytosis, elevated levels of white blood cells. And that's a normal response to infection. Normal if you have an infection going on. Neutrophils are the most abundant white blood cell, about 50 to 70%, so over half of your circulating white blood cells are neutrophils. Lymphocytes are the second most abundant, under half, 25 to 45%. Monocytes are your third most abundant, then the eosinophils and the basophils. There's a simple mnemonic to help you remember the relative abundance of the different white blood cells. Never let monkeys eat bananas. If you just remember that, you can remember the relative abundance. White blood cells circulate through the bloodstream normally, but when you have an infection going on, the leukocytes have to be able to get out of the blood to the site of infection. It's important that leukocytes know where the infection is happening, and this is where cell adhesion molecules come in. What happens is if you have an infection going on in a tissue, that the inflammatory molecules that are released at the site of infection, they tell the blood cells nearby to increase expression of cell adhesion molecules. Right? So the endothelial cells, the cells that line the capillaries near the site of infection, they're now expressing these cell adhesion molecules, and the leukocytes have little receptors on them that recognize the cell adhesion molecules. So the leukocytes grab onto the cell adhesion molecules and roll to a stop. Once they stop, leukocytes have the ability to squeeze through the capillary wall. This process is called diapedesis. So that's what that leukocyte is doing right there and there. That's how the leukocytes get out of the blood. So the cell adhesion molecules tell the leukocytes where to get out of the blood. Diapedesis is the process of them leaving the blood. But now once they get out of the blood, they still need to know exactly where the infection is. So that's where the process of chemotaxis comes in. Chemotaxis is the ability to move in response to chemical signatures. So the bacteria and sometimes other inflammatory cells that got there first, they release inflammatory molecules that set up a concentration gradient. So they're much more concentrated at the site of infection and get more diffuse as they get further away. White blood cells, once they're out of the blood, they can detect this little chemical trail and they can follow it upstream to where it's more concentrated, which is the source of infection. That's chemotaxis. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about each of the types of white blood cells individually. The first type, the most abundant, is the neutrophil. Neutrophils are the granulocytes. It's also appropriate to talk about them first because they are the first responders. So when you have an infection, when you have a bacteria or a virus getting in, the neutrophils are the first ones there. They're the first ones to leave the blood, go to the site of infection, like the EMTs of the white blood cell world. And what they do is phagocytosis. So neutrophils are major phagocyte in the body. Neutrophils and macrophages are the two most common phagocytes, the two major phagocytes. Phagocytosis is cell eating. That is where a cell, like a neutrophil, it basically takes in a bacterium or virus particle and ingests it, takes it in and breaks it down so that you're left with just a little bunch of digested bacterial and viral fragments that can't make you sick. Now, neutrophils are granulocytes, and what they have in their cytoplasmic granules, they're all around in here. They have hydrolytic enzymes. Hydrolytic enzymes are the digestive enzymes, the enzymes that break down bacteria and viruses into little innocuous particles. They also have molecules called defensins. Defensins can basically punch holes in the membrane of bacteria. So these are antibacterial molecules. They lyse the bacteria. They cause them to burst. They also have oxygen-free radicals. Oxygen-free radicals are highly reactive molecules that damage bacterial cells. They react with everything. They react with DNA, proteins, lipids, whatever you got. And they deactivate the molecules, killing the bacteria, right? And it's thought that these oxygen-free radicals are responsible for what's called the respiratory burst. The respiratory burst is this spike in oxygen consumption that happens when neutrophils phagocytose a microbe. And it's still not super clear how the respiratory burst damages pathogens, but it's thought that it's just through the creation of these oxygen-free radicals. Now, as for identifying the neutrophil, The key way to identify it is by looking at the nucleus. They have weird shaped nuclei. It's called multi-lobed because they have these multiple little units, but it's really all one nucleus. So kind of, it may get very thin, but it's still all one. And this multi-lobed nucleus also gives them their alternate name. These guys are sometimes also called polymorphonuclear leukocytes, abbreviated PMNs or PMLs. In the granulocytes, you also have the eosinophils. The eosinophils primarily attack parasitic worms. So in the US, where most people aren't exposed to parasitic worms, we see very low levels of eosinophils. High levels of eosinophils can indicate a parasitic worm exposure. Eosinophils do kind of a nifty thing. Parasitic worms are too big for eosinophils to attack on their own. They're multicellular. So what the eosinophil does is it releases its granules onto the surface of the worm. So it's almost like it kind of vomits onto the worm and digests it extracellularly. Right? Can't take the worm in, so it digests it outside of the cell. For identification, eosinophils have a bilobed nucleus. They tend to see two major lobes. And in a typical blood stain, the eosinophils have red staining granules. And basophils are the rarest white blood cells, so they're found at very, very low levels. The granules in basophils contain the inflammatory molecule histamine. If you have allergies, you may be familiar with histamine because you probably take antihistamines. So yes, basophils can play a role in allergic type responses. They're similar in structure and function to mast cells, but they have different lineages. So their functions are similar to mast cells, but mast cells are typically found in tissues and basophils circulate in the blood. And what I mean by they have different lineages, I mean they have different precursor cells. So mast cells come from a different precursor cell than basophils do. In the agranulocytes, we have the lymphocytes. The lymphocytes are the B cells and T cells, and we'll talk a lot more about these guys when we get to the immune system. They also include the natural killer cells, NK cells. B cells and T cells are part of your adaptive immune system, highly specific for certain bacteria or viruses. And NK cells are part of your innate immune system. They're mostly found in lymphoid tissues, so you're mostly going to find them in the spleen and lymph nodes, but at any given time you have a small percentage circulating through the blood. They're fairly easy to identify. They have a large spherical nucleus, roughly spherical, and very little cytoplasm. So there's just a little bit, that little halo of pale purple is the cytoplasm. The nucleus takes up most of the space in the cell. The last type of white blood cell are the monocytes. Agranulocytes, little to no visible cytoplasmic granules. These are the largest leukocytes, so if you're trying to tell if you're looking at a neutrophil or a monocyte, ask yourself what size is it. Notice how much bigger the monocyte is than the red blood cells around it. These guys, they circulate in the blood, and when you have an infection, the monocytes leave the blood at the site of infection and mature into macrophages. So macrophages are highly, highly phagocytic. They're kind of The neutrophils are the first responders, the really early responders. Macrophages then come in later and do a lot more of the cleanup, phagocytosing any remaining infection and also phagocytosing debris from damaged cells and helping kind of clear out the infection site. Monocytes, apart from size, they have a distinct kidney-shaped nucleus. It won't always be as strongly indented as you see here. Monocytes also have a lot more visible cytoplasm than lymphocytes do. Leukocytes form in the red bone marrow, just like red blood cells do, and they come from the same stem cell precursor. However, the red blood cell and white blood cell lineage separates pretty early. So the hematopoietic stem cell precursor divides into a myeloid stem cell and a lymphoid stem cell. The myeloid stem cell gives rise to the red blood cells in one division and gives rise to the eosinophils, basophils, neutrophils, and monocytes. The lymphocytes are actually derived from the lymphoid stem cell, so slightly different lineage. Same great grandparent, but different, slightly different lineage. So actually, what this means is that these white blood cells, monocytes, neutrophils, basophils, and eosinophils, they're actually more closely related to the red blood cells than they are to the lymphocytes. Leukopoiesis is regulated and it's stimulated by interleukins and colony-stimulating factors. And when you have an infection, your levels of interleukins and CSFs, colony-stimulating factors, go up, so you get more leukopoiesis. There are a number of disorders of the leukocytes that you should be familiar with. Leukopenia refers to a low white blood cell count. It's something that's monitored very closely in individuals that are taking drugs that destroy the bone marrow, like chemotherapy drugs for cancer treatment. Leukopenia is something that's carefully watched for because if you are leukopenic, of course, you're going to be more vulnerable to infection. You've lost your immune resistance to infection. There are also cancers of the white blood cells, the leukemias. Myelocytic leukemias are derived from myeloblasts. It's also sometimes called myeloid leukemia, so it's from that myeloid lineage. Lymphocytic leukemia is derived from lymphocytes, so from that lymphoid lineage. Acute leukemias, so severe, more short-term leukemia is usually seen in children, but you can see slower developing chronic leukemias in the elderly. You might think that leukemia would provide you with greater resistance to infection because you're making more white blood cells, but you would be wrong because the cancerous white blood cells are often non-functional, or at least reduced in function, less functional. So it's paradoxical, but you might be making too many white blood cells and yet still be really vulnerable to infection. You can also get mononucleosis. Mononucleosis is a viral infection. It's caused by infection with the Epstein-Barr virus. And the Epstein-Barr virus infects your B cells. Remember, that's a type of lymphocyte. Causes your B cells to hyperproliferate, so you make a lot of B cells, and that's why if you've ever had mono or you know someone who's had mono, that's why your lymph nodes get so large, because they're just swelling with these excess B cells. Your spleen also gets quite big, and that can be dangerous because it can get so swollen that it's at a risk of rupturing, which can cause severe bleeding. After studying this video, you should be able to address these questions. Talk about the functions of leukocytes, the different types of leukocytes, list how the different frequencies and the functions of each leukocyte, describe how white blood cells are made, and discuss the different types of white blood cell disorders.